So, Shalom Charismatic Community would love to welcome our own parish priest, Father Gary Buckby. And I know it's been a challenging time for you, Father, and we welcome you to speak to us now. In Jesus' name.
Thank you very much. I'm just hoping, as most of you will know, Wednesday is my main on-call day at the hospital. I'm hoping my phone doesn't go while I'm speaking to you. One of the pluses of being part of the team now at the local hospital is that today at 5 o'clock I had my first COVID vaccine. I've got a little badge actually. Here we are. You see my little badge? I've had my COVID vaccination. I've even beaten the Holy Father, the Pope, who gets his next week. Yes, thank you for this opportunity. John asked me to speak, and obviously I said yes, but I also said what I would simply do is just reflect on the last 10, 11 months. And obviously a lot of this is one person's experience, one Christian's experience, one parish priest's experience. So in no sense is what I'm saying to you normative for all of us. And in fact, in many ways, if the truth be known, it's also very unformed because we are still journeying through this odd time with no sort of clear and obvious sort of path for where we will be. Hopefully, if we all do get vaccinated, hopefully we will be in a significantly different place in 6 months' time, but that's not guaranteed. So I'm just going to briefly reflect on perhaps 4 aspects of the pandemic in the way that it's made us see the world as Christians, in the way it makes us see the church as members of it, how it might make us see our parish, and obviously in that particular instance, I can only speak with authority relating to one parish. And then finally, just what has the pandemic done for priests? Obviously, I'm in touch with a variety of priests one way or another, and there's been some unique insights about the nature of priesthood, actually, that have been a fruit of the last 10 or so months. And before I say anything else, I want to say, actually, I am a lot more optimistic now than I was at the start of the pandemic in terms of where this whole series of events is leading us. In the early days of the pandemic, I took place in quite a few divine renovation webinars, and they were brilliant. They were very good. But I have to say this, I found them quite pessimistic. In terms of, this pandemic has accelerated all the trends that were there already by 10 years. I don't see that, not now. I might have shared that initially. So I am optimistic that great good will come for the world, for the church, for parishes, for priests from what we are in the middle of, as long as we are open to what the Spirit tells us within the midst of this experience. And before I move on to those 4 titles, world, church, parish, priest, I think just to say at this point, it is perfectly fine to say, I haven't got a clue where this is leading. There are those who I meet who are saying, oh, we've got to get back to normal. We've got to get back to normal. We want to get back to the old days. And that's fine. And there are others who say, this is the new normal. This is the new normal. We've got to sort of do this, that, and the other. I sit between those 2 camps. I think part of the experience of this for humanity as a whole has been the realization that we're not entirely in control, as much as we might have imagined we were prior to the pandemic. 1957, there was a pandemic, much smaller than this. Obviously, 1918, 1919, there was a pandemic. None of us were alive then. It's okay to say we are in the Lord's hands, and I do not have the definitive answer of where we should be going. And I think it's a good exercise in humility to own that and say it, rather than presume And this was one of my frustrations with the divine renovation stuff, with the webinars. And you'll know I'm a passionate believer in the divine renovation stuff, but it was just a bit too prescriptive for a revised set of circumstances. The general principles, yes, I would stand by to my dying day. And then on top of that, this is one of my bugbears, and I know I've mentioned this in homilies if you've listened online or heard me say this. Don't ever say this is unprecedented. We've had pandemics throughout the whole of human history. I tell you what switched me onto this. One of the things that went by the by, in April last year, I was meant to be jetting off to northern Spain. I was going to be stopping at the Carmelite place in Avila. You'll know that's my thing, Carmelite spirituality, and I was going to do sort of a pilgrimage, St. John of the Cross and St. Therese of Avila, obviously. Well, I didn't get there. The pandemic sorted that. But during the first lockdown, it gave me the chance to read quite vociferously about those two saints, biographies and indeed their works and books about their works. And one phrase suddenly kept on jumping out at their biographies, and it would go something like this. St. Ignatius of Loyola went to Siena with a papal delegation, but they were not allowed to enter the city walls because there was plague. All the while, this is not remotely unprecedented. In fact, you know, the peace and prosperity that we have enjoyed since 1945, and okay, there have been challenges since then, of course there has, but actually we've never had, not wanting to sound like Harold Macmillan, and I wasn't even around when he was the Prime Minister, but we've never had it so good. This is why the pandemic has been such a shock to the system. An interesting exercise is actually to read a little bit on the Great Spanish Flu, as they called it, although of course it wasn't Spanish, and the parallels are just there, you know. Closure of churches, it's happened before. People have moaned about it, people have taken legal action. There's all sorts of stories about churches looking for creative ways of meeting their congregation's needs. Obviously, they hadn't got the Tinternet in those days, but the printing press was widely available. And there is plenty of stories of churches reaching out in all sorts of new ways in 1918, 1919, and indeed 1920 with the Great Spanish Flu. And COVID is a walk in the park next to the Spanish flu in terms of its mortality. I'm sure you all know that. It killed twice as many people as the First World War, 50 million plus. So don't ever say to me this is unprecedented, because every time a politician says that, it's you know, we've got short memories, and obviously none of us have lived through a pandemic of this nature before. But I think that's a useful tool to have in our arsenal, because rather than reinvent the wheel, oh crikey, we've got a pandemic, just look at the history of what the church did 100 years ago and learn from it. There were people, there were priests taking legal actions against local authorities because they'd been closed in those days, etc., etc. There were churches refusing to wear masks, particularly in Spain of all places. There's a famous story of a bishop, an archbishop, who gave complete permission for his parishioners to carry on as normal, and loads died. That's in Spain, Zamora. So it's not unprecedented at all. We've been here before. We'll be here again, hopefully not in the immediate future, but it's good for us to know that we're vulnerable. You know, we are very vulnerable as humanity. So those are just some introductory comments. Let me just compliment 9-ish. Yeah. Okay. Let me just sort of reflect upon, and these are all very shallow and initial observations about the way the pandemic has had an influence upon the world. One of the things that has fed what I'm just briefly going to mention you today is the latest book, Let Us Dream, Pope Francis, and it's actually well worth reading. The reason I suggest that is that if you know the book, you'll know this already, that it's basically the work of Austin Ivory, who is an English speaker. So it's not necessarily a translation, because I find, you know, reading papal stuff, it's obviously a translation of a translation, and it doesn't always flow. in a conversational way, but I've found reading Let Us Dream, it's quite conversational and easy to get into. And it is a book written by the Holy Father in the context of the pandemic, so it's bang up to date. And I think one of the gifts of Pope Francis to the church, and this isn't rocket science, is that he comes from, by his own terminology, the other end of the world. His insights into the human condition are not European, Polish, Italian, German, or whatever. And he draws attention to, the fact that, this pandemic has drawn our attention in a unique way to the way in which we are very much now a global community. The difference with the Spanish flu, and certainly the difference with all those plagues that Teresa of Avila and Ignatius of Loyola lived with, was if they travelled as fast as you could walk, maximum. We live in a truly global world. My favourite football team is owned by Chinese businessmen. Our car industry, some of you will know better than me, is no longer English. We own nothing. And this vaccine has drawn perhaps our attention towards the truth that we are very much a global community, which is in many ways perhaps something of a challenge to some of the political movements to isolation that are taking place in England. This isn't to be political about Brexit, but it is to say that, one of the things that perhaps needs to characterize that debate is the recognition that, we are no longer isolated from one another in the way that we were. The Pope also in this book reflects upon, the amount of goodwill, and I'll talk about this in a moment under one of the other headings, the amount of goodwill that the pandemic has thrown up into the air. And he celebrates that. I had 3 hours ago the Pfizer vaccine, but I'm not sure about the Pfizer vaccine, but I do know that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is not for profit, and indeed will remain not for profit until the end of the pandemic, and for those in the developing world will always be not for profit. That's nice, that's good, that's good. But the Pope also makes the point, and I've made this point, in fact, I made this point just before the pandemic when our churches were closed. So it would be in March, that every year 1.5 million people in the world die from tuberculosis. I was vaccinated against that when I was a child at school, a teenager. We all probably were. In England now, they don't tend to do it. There are antibiotics that can be used if people contract it, and very rarely it does crop up. It costs £1.12 for a tuberculosis vaccine. And I think the point the Pope is making is because it's not a Western problem, it's forgotten. Isn't it astronomical what we've managed to do in 10 months? We have developed a vaccine for something that basically is a variant of the common cold. And we've lived with the common cold for years, and isn't it quite incredible? Where there's a will, there's a way. And I think that's a fair point to make. And one of the concerns is, I know how blessed I am to have had a vaccine. It is a concern that once we're all done, there'll be other parts of the world. A guy who took us around the first time I went to the Holy Land, not the second time, a guy called Juria, is in Bethlehem, and of course Israel is streets ahead of most other nations in terms of vaccination, but it hasn't as yet found its way into the Palestinian occupied territories. Let's hope that there is the global spirit to endeavour to deal with that on a general basis, because we are a global community. So that's simply just a worldwide reflection. The church, Yeah, this is perhaps the hardest one to think through, really, because I'm only one very small part of it, and I'll talk about the parish in a moment. But I wonder if one of the things that this virus gives us a chance to do, if you remember the IKEA advert, for those of you who aren't aware, IKEA is a kind of furniture store, and they had an advert, I don't know if you remember it, chuck out your chintz. And it was encouraging us to chuck out all our rubbish furniture and get some new stuff. And I'd like to think that the virus is that opportunity. A colleague of mine, he has, so did I say, he had, and this won't be an uncommon story, he had a group that met in his church hall on a Monday, and they were a pain. It's not local to this area, so if there are any connections, they're incidental. They were an absolute nightmare, and he's got rid of them. And it's a chance to sort of, restart, as it were. And I think we'd be foolish to not think long and hard about what that might actually look like. Because, I mean, this is James Mallon's language, not mine. The core message is exactly the same. All that's had to change is how we do it. And I think, this is an opportunity for us to seize with both hands. I will say at the moment, I think it's very hard to evangelize. I wasn't switched on to this until I went away for a few days in late summer, well, September. And I went to Mass. And one of the things I think it's good for a priest to do when he's away from his parish is to just go and be anonymous. And it was horrible. I had to book. Fancy having to book to come to Mass. At the door, I mean, there were people who met me, but they were lovely. I mean, this isn't a criticism of the place where I went, but, they told me where I could sit and where I couldn't sit. I had to sit there with a mask on. It's not pleasant. I had to sit far away from everybody else, etc., etc. There's no music. It was an interesting experience for me, having sort of been obviously at the other side of the altar for 4 or 5 months with people coming to St. Rose or St. Peter's, to experience it from the other side and perhaps to become more sensitive to that as an experience. I think hopefully one of the fruits of this experience for the church will be a revised thirst for, a renewed thirst for the Eucharist. I was lucky in that by and large during the lockdowns, I said Mass with one other person in church, that being Sam. On one occasion, I said Mass on my own, and I thought this is nonsense. To rediscover what it means to believe in the real presence, which isn't just a sort of theological premise that's in the tabernacle, but actually is something that takes heart and shape in the life of the people of God. I also hope that one of the fruits of this as well is a deeper recognition of the relationship between priest and people. I tell you what switched me onto this was the first day, the 4th of July, Independence Day, that we were allowed to open for public Mass. And I walked out and there were people there, and it was like, oh, thank the Lord for that. I think that's a good sign for a priest. And I've perhaps become aware of this. I mean, recently, you might be aware, I had to read, and I did read it because not every parish priest did. I had to read that statement by the diocese about Joe Quigley. Awful, but I felt it was so important that I read it and not ignore it. I had some lovely messages afterwards from people who were at Mass or watching via YouTube, who said, that must have been horrible to read, and I can't imagine how it feels for you as a member of that presbyterate to have read that, but thank you, and we're with you. Lovely. So I hope, having been separate from one another, that we sort of renew the symbiotic relationship that exists between a priest and a parishioners. I always say we look very stupid without parishioners, and it is stupid without parishioners. And I also think as well, I hope one of the fruits for the church is that we just develop that thirst for the Eucharist and regain the incarnational nature of our faith. And that's the thing about the sacraments, you know, their water, their oil, their bread, their wine, their touch, you know, to have to sit 2 meters away from each other and like grimly wave at the peace, you know, it isn't natural to us as human beings. We've adapted and we've got used to it, but it's still, you know, I mean, I'll do a funeral tomorrow. As the family walk out, every instinct in my body tells me to stick my hand out and shake their hand and hold their hands, you know, and speak to them, and perhaps even if I know them well enough to give them a hug. I can't do it. And I hope we're going to rediscover that, you know, Christianity, I mean, this is why we're on the tail end of Christianity, is an earthy, it's not a spiritual sort of experience. And worship together is an earthy experience rooted in the real: bread, wine, touch, word, song, music. So I yearn for that day when we can publicly, you know, I still plan, I know I said this probably the first mass that was live streamed on a Sunday, that when all this is over, we're going to have one Sunday with just one mass, probably at St. Rose because it's bigger, where we can all come together. I'm still going to do that, but I'm not going to do that obviously until this is completely done and dusted, and that will be one hell of a bash, because all these principles will be well and truly lived out. I think as regards the church, and certainly this is perhaps getting closer towards the parish, it still sort of demonstrates to me very clearly that there needs to be a massive change in the cultural mindset of the church as an institution, and indeed of many of us who are members of the church. There was a little correspondence. We have a parish WhatsApp group, and there was a little correspondence a couple of weeks ago that one of the BBC presenters, I didn't see the article, but it was on our BBC morning breakfast news, and they were talking about how this year there's a movement to leave your decorations up because everybody's so blinking miserable because of the virus. And whoever it was who was watching pointed out that the television presenter didn't know what epiphany was. And she said, I'd never heard that word before. Why are we surprised? But we're still, and this is what the point I'm trying to make, and this is very much the divine renovation point. The model that we're still operating, even in lockdown, really presumes that there's Christendom out there, and if we just blow a little bit harder on the embers of it, it'll burst into flame. And actually, I want to suggest that it's mission territory. It's cold mission territory out there. But what we tend to do in church, definitely with our schools, presumes that it, you know, I've done this myself. If I just work a little bit harder at the sacramental preparation, if I put something on extra for the parents this year, then they'll bite. And it's presuming that it's Christendom. It isn't. Cultural Catholicism is well and truly dead. And if anything has made us aware of this, it's this virus. I'll tell you one of the things that switched me on to this. On the 7th of June, it's funny how these dates stick in your head. The 7th of June was a Sunday. And I was aware that the 14th of June should have been First Communion Sunday. So if you were watching, you might have heard me say in the notices, right, kids, I'm really sorry, but next week you won't have your First Communion. I'm really sorry about that. There's nothing we can do about it. However, it would be great to involve you in the Mass. And if you've watched our Mass, you'll know that in lockdown, all the readings, etc., were recorded by people and sent to me, and we live stream them. So I said, right, kids, I want a first reader, a psalmist, a second reader, an Alleluia type person, and 6 of you to contact me. So 10 in total, to do the bidding prayers. So 4 readers effectively and 6 bidding prayers. And it's going to be quite literally first come, first served. I've got nothing. In the end, I had to chase the school up and say, I don't know if you've heard me say this. No, we didn't. Oh, well. Now, all that suggests to me is that those children who were going to make their First Communion the next week were totally disengaged the week before. Just as a simple observation, and it's sort of like just a reminder of perhaps where we are in that regard. So that's very briefly the nature of the church. Parishes, right? Now, don't get me started. Where do I begin? Isn't it amazing the journey we've been on? Obviously, I don't think we're particularly unique in this as a parish, but we now have live streaming, which before March the 20th we did not. On a Sunday, you can, because one of my concerns was that those who haven't got the internet cannot therefore access Mass. So on a Sunday, you can dial a number and you can listen to Mass live. And that's been a pattern that's been repeated across many, many parishes, certainly in this part of the world, and I presume further afield. And I have to say, certainly as regards this parish, Bartley Green and Weoley Castle, live streaming is here to stay. There's no way I'm going to get rid of it. We're going to have to do something about the way we do it, because if you've been in church, you'll see it's all a bit Heath Robinson with cables all over the place and a camera right in front of the sanctuary. So once we are through this period, we'll get it professionally installed so it's out of the way and more straightforward. But I've been aware in my own small way of the massive impact of the daily Mass that is live streamed. And I think one of the major fruits of this period of time has been, and it's funny, our bishops in this part of the world, in England and Wales, invited us to have a year of the word. And last year, all sorts of events were organised for the Year of the Word, which were cancelled. Thank God for that, because the faithful discovered the Word for themselves in their own homes in a unique way. I know lots of people don't watch Mass. I certainly wouldn't watch Mass every day myself, but I know, we tend to have about 30 live viewers in a weekday, and then the viewing figures go up to about 60 or 70, something like that. And what people do is they go and listen to the homily. They told me, and that's fine. That's fine. That's people taking a bit of time to feed themselves and read the Word of God in their own homes, which I'm willing to bet you £1 million many of them did not do this time last year. So praise be to God for that. I'm also aware of the power of online for outreach. I was having a conversation with a priest about this, and he was saying, but it's not the same as real attendance, and to a certain extent, I accept that. It's no substitute for real attendance, and it's not meant to be. But he was saying, they're not engaged. And I said, hang on. You and I have stood in front of congregations and preached, and we have thought to ourselves, not one person is listening to a word I'm saying. They're reading the bulletin, they're looking at their phone. So don't fool yourself that just because they're sitting in the pew, they're engaged. Now, obviously, lots of people are engaged, but there's a lot more to being engaged than actually coming and putting your bottom on a pew in my or anybody else's church, for that matter. So I think, first of all, the power of the online presence to actually reach out to others is incredible, because I think we have little idea what a scary proposition it is to go to church for the first time. We're used to it. But even when I go elsewhere anonymously on holiday, there's that little tinge of nervousness, because the doors are usually quite forbidding. You open this door, what's going to be there? Is some smiley Christian going to jump on me? And then there's another door. And if I sit here, will I be in somebody else's place? The beauty of the online is that you can go to Mass and feel totally unthreatened. You can even turn it off if you decide this isn't for you. And on Thursday nights, I've got like a adult RCIA running via Zoom. I think we're all zoomed out a little bit. And two of the people on that are people who just dipped into Mass. And dipped into Mass again and dipped into Mass again. and eventually had put up the courage to email me and say, oh, I'm enjoying your Mass. Can I come? Yeah, you need to book. So praise the Lord for that. And where that leads, we don't know. But certainly the online thing is most definitely here to stay. I think it's interesting. Some people, one person said to me, we listen to your homily, but we go to the oratory for the rest. That's lovely. So that's the online stuff. As regards parish community, well, I have to confess, when this first started, and some of you will remember this, we tried to set up a telephone ringing scheme where people would ring each other. It didn't happen, and the reason it didn't happen was I discovered it was already happening, and praise God for that, really. People were saying, well, I'm already ringing so and 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 so. And I think that's something to actually celebrate. And that continues now. I know, I mean, I was speaking to somebody today and they said, oh, so-and-so's just rang. I haven't put the phone down all morning. Well, that's great. I perhaps didn't see that side of our parishes until we found ourselves in this time of pandemic. Moving very quickly on, one of the challenges for me, and this is perhaps unique to this parish, but I'm fully aware that the English Catholic Church has always been a church that has been held up by immigration, Irish, and now more recently immigration from Southeast Asia and Africa, not so much Africa here, but certainly Africa in other parts of the UK. Very hard to engage those communities. I mean, I'll give you a simple example thereof. We've got stewards for Sunday Mass, and I have a healthy team of 32. If you come to Sunday Mass here, I'm going to guess 60–70% are born overseas, largely Filipino with a small proportion of Indians. None of the stewards are from those parts of the world. And that's something that I think all our parishes need to wrestle with, to say to them, it's your parish. Yeah, you get stuck in. You're the future of it, really. I think that's a big challenge, certainly for us here. And then let me just finish with sort of some reflections on what it's done to priesthood. And this is, I'm aware that it's nearly 9:10. I think it's given us an opportunity to re-examine what priesthood is all about. My first lockdown had sort of 3 ingredients, really. The most beautiful thing was that everything in my diary was just pushed off like pieces off a chessboard. It was brilliant. But the essentials remained. I had more time for prayer. I had my 2 companions, Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross. I had all my commitments at the QE. I had 64 funerals in those 2 months. It gave me a renewed sense that, you know, the busyness isn't good. You know, do you want a busy priest or a holy priest? And I won't expect you to answer that immediately because it's a deeper question than it initially sounds. I do want you to pray for priests because there have been a lot of my colleagues who are struggling very much with depression. One of the problems is that we're all being told to stay at home, and that's lovely. But unfortunately for us, that means stay at work. And I mean, certainly I miss when I take a day off. The old thing was to get on a bus and go to a pub somewhere or go for a long walk. It's not so easy at the moment. But I wonder whether, you know, as priests, it's given us an opportunity to say, why are we doing all this? You know, why am I a chair of governors of 2 schools? You do not need to be ordained to be a chair of governors. I'm not an educational professional. I lack the skill set for it, really. And that's not because of a lack of commitment to the schools. It's just, I think it's a deep issue. So there we are. I've written loads more notes, but time is moving on. So I don't know if anybody wants to come back at me or ask any questions. Or...
Thank you very much, Father Gary. Any questions before we go into Conflin?
The only comment I was going to make was that you mentioned live streaming the masses, Father, and I remember having a conversation with you when you first came to parish within the first year or so, and saying just that would be great if you could live stream the mass to say to the elderly who couldn't come to mass and that sort of thing. And now that's what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, we did get quotes. A lot of churches, I think St Bridget's, use a company. What you lose with that, I mean, it's £5,500 to have it installed, and then there's ongoing costs. You lose, as far as I'm aware, some of the sort of creativity that we have with our YouTube stream in terms of I can bang music in. We have complete control of it. So in many ways, you know, Mass was better when there were no people there, Sunday Mass, because we could chuck stuff in. Music, and we took a lot of time over it. If you've watched, you know, it was designed to be a positive experience as much as that was possible. Now we've got people in, we can't, obviously we can play a video or two, but we can't sing. So the Mass now we've got people here is a lot more small scale than
the parish that I'm a part of in Anchorage, they did two things. They did the video of the Mass inside the church, and they were able to do music because the church was big enough. They could have the musicians were in a family, and so they could be on that side of the church, and the deacon and his wife did the readings on the other side of the church, and the priest was in the middle. And then they were able in Anchorage to, when it was done, offer communion outdoors, you know, and so the people would watch online, and then they would get in their cars and drive to the church and receive communion, and that worked really well. And the other thing they did was to have a Saturday night Mass where they moved the altar and the ambo from the chapel out into the outdoors, and people would gather in the parking lot inside their cars. And then when it was time for responses, they would flash their lights to say we're doing the responses, so that it felt like there was a community action going on. And so there are ways to try to bring in community, but like you said, it's very hard.
Wow, Ruth,
Well, we had pirate radio stations in England. They used to be anchored offshore in the North Sea. And so these guys, these DJs were stuck on these ships for like 3 weeks at a time, and they'd get people to drive up to the coastline and flash their lights. That's the image I've got way back. Only in America, though, Ruth. Father, are you going to do that? Let's have some light flashing in the car park.
We've got lights flashing outside. Christmas tree.
Yeah.
I did think of an outdoor Mass in the summer, in August, for St Rose's Day, which is the 23rd of August, is it? It's the weather. First of all, it meant that I asked the diocese, and it meant I'd have to do a second risk assessment, but also as well in the risk assessment, I'd need a contingency for bad weather. And obviously this is England.
yeah.
There's no guarantee. So, you know,
Same
wake up Sunday morning and, you know, you've got 100 people turning up for an outdoor Mass. You've got to have a contingency plan in your risk assessment. So I thought, let's not risk it.
Yeah. I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Father Gary. I will let you take a look at that before we do anything else with it. So thank you, everybody.